In this chapter, we're going to take up the economic theory of the consumer. In other words, it's going to tell us how consumers choose what they buy. To be quite honest about it, consumer theory and economics is not my favorite topic, and the reason it's not is simply because I don't think people are quite as methodical as we believe they are. On the other hand, I do think consumer theory can tell us some things that are fairly important, and we'll discuss those as the chapter goes on. Further, though, in the next chapter, we'll talk about something called behavioral economics, where we're more and more studying the fact that consumers don't quite choose the way our theory does. We base our theory of the consumer on something called margin utility theory. So, for instance, assume we can measure satisfaction we obtain from goods with a unit called utils. Now, I know that's a little bit silly, but let's make that assumption. So we look at a product and we say, oh, that'll give us 10 utils of utility. We assume as we consume more of a good in a period of time, the utility we receive from each additional unit will decline. This is known as diminishing margin utility, and this is pretty easy to understand. First of all, we're talking about a period of time. So for instance, let's assume you're really hungry and you go to the restaurant and you order a pizza. Well, the first slice, wow, that was great. Man, that gave me, I was starved and I really wanted that. Second piece probably makes me pretty happy too, gives me a lot of satisfaction. About the third piece, though, I'm getting a little fuller and I begin to feel like, well, maybe I'm not getting as much out of that one as I did the first two. And about the sixth or seventh one, you're getting absolutely stuffed. Those aren't really going to give you much margin utility either. So the concept of margin utility is fairly sound. I often talk about going and having a drink, and so you can go through that process there to the point where, well, that last drink I have makes me sick, so my margin utility there is probably negative. Let me give you an example of diminishing margin utility in this simple table here. Assume we can choose 1, 2, 3, or 4 units of a product, and if I consume 1, it gives me total utility of 8. If I consume 2, it gives me total utility of 15. If I consume 3, it gives me total utility of 21. If I consume 4, it's going to give me total utility of 26. But what we're really interested in is how much we get from each additional unit. So obviously I'm going to assume that 0 units gives me 0 utility. So when I consume the first unit of the product, I'm getting 8 units of margin utility, 8 minus 0. When I consume the second one, I'm going to get 7, 15 minus 8. When I consume the third, I'm going to get 6, that's 21 minus 15. And when I consume the fourth, I'm going to get 26 minus 21, or 5 units of utility. So as the table above shows, the units consumed during a period of time, the total utility received from consuming all these units, and the margin utility received from consuming additional units. And you can see that additional units provide less utility. That probably is fairly rational. So what are our assumptions behind consumer theory? Well, first, we're assuming rational behavior, meaning, we're not going to spend all our money on one product, is probably just the simplest way to put it. We're going to choose from a combination of many goods, and we're going to attempt to maximize our total utility. We're also assuming that people have clear-cut preferences. They really know what they want. Third, we're assuming we have a budget constraint. What does that mean? I only have so much money to spend. And fourth, we're assuming that goods have prices. In other words, I have to use some of my budget to buy the good, and that's going to spend part of my money, and it's going to limit what I can in fact buy. So let's discuss what we call the utility maximizing rule. We assume consumers choose based on margin utility, not total utility, and they will choose the good that gives them the most utility per dollar spent. The next slide gives an example of this. So here we have 2 goods, A and B, and I have labeled the margin utility of number of units of each, and I've also given you the margin utility, since we've already discussed how we go from total utility to margin utility. But in the next column, I'm going to discuss, I've calculated something called the margin utility of A and the margin utility of B. So what I've done is I've assumed, first of all, good A is costing me $1, good B is costing me $2. So what I do is I take the margin utility and I divide it by the price. That's my third column. So for good A, my margin utility of A divided by the price of A for unit 1 is 9 divided by 1. For 2, it's 7 divided by 1. For 3, it's 5 divided by 1, etc. And B, then it's the margin utility for the first one is 16, but I have to divide that by 2, so my margin utility divided by the price is 8 for the first one, 7 for the second one, 6 for the third one, 5 for the fourth one, and then 3 for the fifth one, and 1 for the sixth one. So we're also going to assume that the consumer has a budget of $11. And the consumer will choose the unit that gives them the most marginal utility per dollar. So first they'll choose a unit of A that gives them marginal utility of 9 per dollar. Then they'll choose a unit of B. Why? Because I'm going to compare that first unit of A to the second unit of B, and I'm going to choose A because that first unit of A gives me more marginal utility per dollar than the second unit of B. Then we'll choose either B or A since the marginal utility per dollar is the same, and since we have enough money, we're going to choose both. We're going to continue to choose until we exhaust our budget, and that's going to be at the point where we choose 4B and 3A, and then we're going to be out of money, and we can't spend any. So this tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us we're going to maximize the utility we get from each dollar spent. It also tells us something about what we call the utility maximizing rule. And we're going to note that consumers have chosen up to the point where in the last unit, the margin utility of A divided by the price of A is equal to the margin utility of B divided by the price of B. And again, let's keep in mind, that's the very last unit. At that point, the margin utility divided by the price is 5 for each of these. So at that point, we've exhausted the budget, but we've also maximized our utility because we have maximized the margin utility for each dollar spent. And that rule is going to hold across all goods so that the margin utility of A divided by the price of A equals the margin utility of B divided by the price of B equals the margin utility of C divided by the price of C, etc., etc., etc. So how does this relate to our demand curve? Well, it's actually, you can see this fairly simple. Since the margin utility declines for each additional unit, then this implies a downward sloping demand curve. For instance, assume that we're willing to pay $1 for each unit of utility gain. Then the demand curve for A will be $9 for the first unit, $7 for the second, $5 for the third, etc. Thus, if the market price is $4, then we'll not buy a fourth unit because it only gives us 3 units of utility. So it's worth $3 to us, but it's going to cost $4. Also, how does this relate to our income and substitution effect that we discussed earlier in a previous chapter? Well, the substitution effect says if things get cheaper, or if a product gets cheaper, we'll substitute away from the more expensive product to the cheaper product. On the other hand, the income effect says, well, if price of something goes down, then we have more real income. In other words, we're probably able to buy more of maybe both. And so how does this show those two effects? Well, assume the price of B falls to $1 and we still have an $11 budget. By choosing the same way we did before, then we'll choose 6B and 5A. This means we have now chosen more B and substituted for A, that's the substitution effect, but we've also chosen more of both, and this shows the income effect. So we can see this at work in this particular case. Obviously, that's a pretty hefty drop in price, but good for the example. Let's use an example, though, of medical care and how this can apply. And medical care is an excellent example. As we've talked in class, you can know in many cases I'm not a big supporter of most government programs, and most people, I won't say most, but many people believe national health care is a solution. Well, the reality is most economists will argue that having third-party payers, that doesn't mean the government, it simply means insurance companies or anybody who's going to pay part of the cost, increases consumption of medical care. Why? Well, with most medical insurance, we pay a copay. So when I go to the doctor, I'm going to pay maybe $25 for a visit. The real cost of this may be $100. The insurance company's picking up the rest. But what am I concerned about? I'm only concerned about the $25 that I have to pay, and so I'm going to choose based on the $25 I have to pay. And so my margin utility might be 100 or 1,000 even. I'd divide that by the price, and I'd say, okay, is this, compared to other goods, is this something I want to do? On the other hand, if I had to pay the full $100, then I'd visit the doctor less frequently. Why? Because margin utility per dollar is going to be less. This tends to drive up the demand for medical care. Many people assume the demand for medical care is perfectly inelastic. In other words, we're assuming we have a vertical demand curve. Well, it's been shown it's not, and therefore programs such as national health care that cut the cost of a visit to zero see a huge increase in demand for medical care. Whenever you develop a government program, you have to project out over many years the cost of that program. And Medicare, which was developed for retired people, if you go back and look at the estimates, we're only several 100% well over where the projections were. Why? They probably assumed almost a perfectly inelastic demand. And so obviously that wasn't true, and so the cost had spiraled. This is often true in national health care. It tends to lead to shortages. Why? Because you only have a limited supply of health care. It makes people wait longer to see a doctor. So in Britain, for instance, you may wait quite a long period of time. In fact, a few years ago, the director of the National Health Care Program in Britain bragged that nobody had to wait more than 1 year for a hospital bed. If we had to wait that long in the United States, we'd probably sue the hospital. Maybe you wait a few days or a week or two, but you'd never wait a year. But the reality is, with medical care, that medical problems are self-limiting. So quite bluntly, you're either going to get better or you're going to die if you don't see a doctor. That means the rationing process that they're using with national health care is based on how long you can wait. And with some diseases, that's not a good thing. So the mortality rate for cancer in national health care countries is much higher than it is in the United States. Why? Well, as you're waiting to see the doctor and get tested and everything, the cancer is getting worse, and so your chances of surviving are just not as good. So, we see this as a perfect example. Again, most government programs that cut prices to zero see a huge increase in demand because everybody's going to look at it, say, what's my margin utility per dollar? Well, you're dividing by zero, so you're going to choose a lot more medical care. And in fact, the book uses an example, which I've mentioned in class, about how you apply this to eating at a buffet versus going to a restaurant and ordering off the menu. At the buffet, the cost of adding another portion is zero, so you eat more than you would have otherwise. On the other hand, at the beginning of this discussion, I said that there are a couple of things that it really does tell us. One, choosing by consumers is totally subjective. We know that. I may get a lot out of it, you may get a lot out of it. And the other is it may change over time. So the very fact that we understand the subjective, I think, is probably a very useful tool. And the other is that we're all going to be differing in the kinds of budgets we have and in the kind of choices we make. And in fact, there have been all kinds of economic studies on the economics of crime, which your book mentions. And the simple reality is that crime, the police will tell you, many petty crimes are simply crimes of opportunity. So some criminal walks down the street, checks your door to see if it's locked, and if it isn't, he gets into your car and gets something. If the door is locked, he goes to the next car. So in this case, what we have done is we've increased the cost to the criminal. So locking doors and such does. Some years ago when I was on the city council, I had a young lady call me and she was complaining about her apartment. Things have been stolen from it and that things have been stolen from her car. Well, I contacted the police, they contacted her, and they went to see her. Well, she refused to lock her car, she refused to lock her doors, so basically there wasn't much we could do. And therefore, we just more or less said, well, if you're not going to lock it, there's not much we can do. We can't post a policeman by your car in your apartment all the time. So again, margin utility has some value. The problem is I do believe it has somewhat limited value because it's kind of a very strict approach to choosing. How does it take into account things like impulse buying? It doesn't. And of course, if margin utility worked the way we thought it did, and by the way, it probably does for people like me, then people wouldn't, probably marketing wouldn't work very well. You know, we'd be really methodical and very objective about the way we're choosing, and probably wouldn't work very well. So, in this chapter, we've talked about consumer theory. Next chapter, we're going to talk about consumer behavioral economics, which gets us into, do people really act the way we think they do? And the answer to that may well be no, or maybe we'll find out it's yes.